A political science graduate from BYU, has worked in the Utah Lieutenant Governor's office in the elections division. She has experience with fundraising, event planning, volunteer work. She's organized large-scale humanitarian projects, small-scale service projects closer to home. She's active in her church community and in teaching and mentoring. She's also currently serving as the political director for an organization called Better Days 2020, which I am quite fond of. I say that only because I teach a survey research class in our department, and Better Days 2020 has been our client for our class for the last 2 years, and we just launched a survey for them this morning. So she'll tell you, I'm sure, a little bit more about that. I won't go into the details there. But she manages their legislative agenda and their relationships with elected officials. You could say she's a lobbyist in that sense, I think. She also serves as the committee chair for the Martha Hughes Cannon Statue Selection Committee. And I'm sure she'll tell you more about that too, or perhaps you can ask her about that if she doesn't. She's also an outdoors lover. She's crisscrossed the state of Utah on Jeep, boat, foot, and by bike. And she has 3 daughters, and apparently they like crepes. So I'll stop there, and without further ado, let's welcome our guest.
Thanks for having me here. Is that picking up? Okay, great. It was just over 20 years ago that I was in your seats here, and it's kind of fun to be back here today, and it's been fun to work with the survey research class and have that time back on BYU campus. So on February 14th, 1870, Sarah Young dropped her ballot into the box in Salt Lake City, and she became the first woman in the modern United States to cast a ballot. And she was joined that day by 23 other women whose names have been lost to history. And it was a pivotal moment in the women's suffrage story, and also just a catalyst in the women's rights movement, those votes that took place that day. So my work with Better Days 2020, it's a Utah nonprofit, and our mission is to popularize Utah women's history in creative and communal ways. And the way that we're doing that is focusing on the suffrage anniversaries that are happening next year in 2020. So in 2020, it's the 150th anniversary of Utah voting, but it's also the celebration of Utah being the first place where women voted. And then it's the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment, which gave all women across the United States the right to vote. And then we've got the Voting Rights Act in 1965. So it's the 55th anniversary of the Voting Rights Act, which finally pushed that out so that women of color and everyone could actually exercise their franchise there. So my job then is our legislative agenda centered around that. It's the relationships with elected officials, and then it's all of the statewide campaign and project management around all of just the different things that we're doing in that coincide with that. So I wanted to talk and just start today. We're just coming out of the legislative session. It ended about 2 weeks ago. I'm almost caught up on sleep. And I wanted to tell you a little bit about what a legislative session is like here in Utah. So 45 days, starts at the beginning of January, goes to the middle of March. And there's little things and just little nuances that you learn as you kind of go through that. I know that it takes exactly an hour to get from my kitchen into the rotunda of the Capitol. And that includes parking, which, if you're familiar with the Utah Capitol during the legislative session, is an absolute nightmare. So I've got a special spot north of the Capitol on Cortez Street. And I have friends that swear that if you circle the Capitol, they say about 3 times, you can slide into a spot. I don't have time for that. So I drive up to Cortez Street, park the car, and I'm like, I count that as my sunlight for the day, because by the time I walk out, it's dark again at the end of the day. So find your parking spot, know how long it takes. You have to know how to get in touch with people. So outside the Senate and the House, they have, there's a little desk, and there's these cute little old men that sit out there, and they've got blue notes outside the Senate, and they have green notes outside the House. And you write down your name and your phone number and who you want to talk to, and they walk those notes into legislators. Now, if you're a constituent and you're one of their constituents, then they're going to come out and talk to you. If you're a lobbyist, they're busy. They're voting, they've got a whole bunch of other stuff going on. And so you have to know, who responds to text. You have to know, and there's little secrets that you learn along the way. If you know the intern's phone numbers, then it's a lot easier to do it that way. If you know staff, then there's other ways, and so there's just little tips and tricks that you learn. I think one of the most interesting things for me during the session is just seeing firsthand how what's happening up on Capitol Hill in the halls there is so very different than what I'm reading about in the newspaper. And that's an interesting, I much prefer the behind the scenes look at how things are working. So my first session with Better Days 2020 was last year during the 2018 session. And our legislative agenda that year had 3 different little components that we were working on. There was an appropriation, we had the first to vote license plate bill, and then we had Martha. Now the appropriation that year was, Senator Deidre Henderson was the sponsor for that. She was in leadership, and she is a champion for Better Days, and she's also kind of a rock star in the Senate from my perspective. And so that was something that we had a few meetings that we worked, that we met with people on committees, and we were lobbying, and we had some literature and a one-pager and things like that we'd put together. But the appropriation was not something that we had to babysit very much last year. The first to vote license plate was a little bit more hands-on. And for me, what that looked like, Senator Henderson, again, was the sponsor of that. And it was the whole process of how a bill gets turned into a law. And so we started with the idea. We wanted to have a license plate that showcased Utah as the first place where a woman voted. So we took that. Senator Henderson connected me with legislative research, where all of the research and all of the writing for those bills is done. And then I worked with Kurt in legislative research, and we worked back and forth on the language and the kind of license plate that we were going to do. And I learned more about license plates than probably anyone ever needs to know. And the only people that know more about license plates are serving prison time, because that's where the license plate gets made. So we worked through the details of what kind of a plate it was going to be. So you've seen BYU plates floating around and know people probably that have those. If you get that kind of a special group license plate, then you're paying a $20 fee every year, and that's money that goes back to the university. It's kind of a fundraiser there. Our first to vote license plate is just, it falls under a special category of those special group license plates where there's no additional fees. So when you register your car, it's just one that you can select there. And I would encourage you all, as your grandmothers have their $20 that they're going to spend on your birthdays coming up, to tell her that you need a first to vote license plate and go through that process there. So it was a fun, the bill was non-controversial. We walked through all the steps. We went through the House, we went through the Senate, and it was great. It passed unanimously. The governor signed it into law, and last October 1st, you were able to order your first to vote license plate. And then there was Martha, and this ended up being a whole different experience for us. So back in National Statuary Hall in Washington, D.C., every state gets to contribute 2 statues. And of the 100 statues that sit in National Statuary Hall in the collection there, Utah has Brigham Young, and they have Philo T. Farnsworth. And the genesis for this idea started with Adam Gardner, who was one of Rob Bishop's interns years ago. And one of the jobs of an intern at the U.S. Capitol is to do tours. And they take people around, and they talk about the statues, and they explain them. And Adam always had, so Philo Farnsworth was one of the statues for Utah, and there's kind of this joke up among the Utah interns that every state gets 2 statues, and Idaho has 3, because Philo Farnsworth is technically he was born in Utah, but then he lived the rest of his life in Idaho. And so Adam had this idea. He learned about Martha Hughes Cannon and thought how great it was if one day we had a statue of her there. And I want to tell you, so let me tell you a little bit about Martha and why she was so suited to this. So she was original Utah pioneer. She crossed the plains when she was 4 years old. Her family was from Wales. Her little sister, who was 1, died on the trail. Her dad passed away 2 days after they got to the Salt Lake Valley. I mean, all the stories of all the things about life is hard and all of those. So Martha grows up, they have no money, everyone's working, and at 14 she's teaching school. And she absolutely hates it. There's 17-year-old boys in the class that are taller than she is, and she has no classroom management skills because, she's 14. And she decides that school teaching is not for her, and she goes and gets a job. She's offered a job at the Woman's Exponent, which is this incredible newspaper, as a typesetter. And as she's setting type one day, she reads that the University of Michigan is now accepting women into their medical program. And she decides that she wants to be a doctor, watching her sister and her father pass away. And she's like, I think that there's something that I could do. She goes to Brigham Young, and he's calling women to go back and earn their medical degrees. And she becomes one of the women that's called for that. So she goes to the University of Deseret, which is now the University of Utah, and earns her chemistry degree. And then she heads off to the University of Michigan. So when she comes back to Utah at 25, she's earned 4 degrees. She has the chemistry degree from the University of Deseret. She's got a medical degree from the other university, and then she went to Pennsylvania and earned 2 more degrees in pharmaceuticals. And then she decided that she wanted to be able to talk a little bit more and more eloquently about her medical work, and so her 4th degree was in elocution and oratory, which actually served her very well later in life. So she comes back to Utah. She's the resident physician at the University of Deseret, or at the Deseret Hospital, and they specialize in obstetrics. And she's training nurses and doing all of these incredible things. She marries Angus Cannon. She's his 4th wife. This is after polygamy is now illegal, and so their marriage is a secret for a long time. And then she gets pregnant, and and then the marriage is not a secret, and she ends up fleeing to Europe, because if she, here as a doctor, not only can she be forced to testify against her husband, but she's delivered hundreds of babies now and is a prime target to be brought into court to be able to testify about who belongs with whom and what baby belongs to which family and which father specifically. So she takes her 1-year-old and goes to Europe and basically flees the country until things have died down a little bit. And she comes back and then she decides, along with all of that, and while that's happening, the Edmunds-Tucker Act is passed in 1887. So Utah women start voting in 1870, and then 70 years later, that right for all women is revoked. Polygamous, non-polygamous, doesn't matter if you're a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints or not, anything. No women anymore are allowed to vote. And after exercising that franchise for 17 years, that's not okay. And the women of Utah were not happy about it. And they start organizing and advocating, and they're doing petitions, and they're having indignation meetings. And Martha ends up in this group back at the Chicago World's Fair in 1893. It was called the Columbia Exposition, the kind of women's pavilion. And they're talking about what it was like to vote and why women voting is such a good thing. And she is just on fire because she has this degree in elocution and oratory, and she's a great speaker. And she gets back to Chicago, and she wires home that she needs a little bit more money. And she had looked around and decided that she did not want to look like a Utah pioneer. And so she shows up that day for her speeches, and she's got a matching green hat and gloves, and she's all decked out. And she's a great speaker. From Chicago, they go on to Washington, D.C., and Martha has the opportunity to testify before Congress about suffrage. And she comes home from that, and then in 1895, the territorial legislature, they're working on the new Utah Constitution, and the right for women to vote is enshrined in that. And Martha runs in that next election for a seat in the Utah State Senate. The interesting part, one of the interesting parts about Martha's story is that one of the other candidates in that election is her husband. So there are 5 open seats in the Senate, and Martha's running as a Democrat, Angus is running as a Republican, and Martha wins the election. So that made national headlines. And the Salt Lake Tribune had some really funny little, headlines about Mrs. Cannon being the better man for the job. And, you can just imagine, kind of how complicated that would make your home life a little bit. So Martha takes her place in the Senate. She is the first woman in the United States selected as a state senator. And she serves in a distinguished way. Her legislation is today, we have the School for the Deaf and the Blind, and we also have a State Department of Health because of the work that Martha did. She cared about public sanitation, and she had legislation that made it so that teachers with tuberculosis couldn't be in the classroom. And she just was using her professional life and advocating for the things that she cared about and the things that she knew about and the things that mattered to her. She only served one term in the Senate because halfway through, again, she got pregnant. And this is after, again, polygamy is not legal, and technically she was a single woman because Angus had a first and second and third wife already, and that ended her political career. So she was an amazing woman, and the opportunity to put her statue in National Statuary Hall in August of 2020, when the nation's celebrating the 100th anniversary of women gaining the right to vote, has this amazing kind of synchronicity. And at Better Days, we just were like, we can't pass up this once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. There should be this, we should put this statue of Martha Hughes Cannon in National Statuary Hall. And we thought that was a great idea and couldn't imagine that there would be any opposition to that. And then we hit the Senate floor. And it did okay. We were kind of a little bit surprised at the debate and kind of the pushback from that. It ended up passing the Senate about 3-1. But it almost didn't, and then all of a sudden the furor starts to build about that. And if you're ever, just looking for something to do, the committee minutes from the House committee meeting around, it was SCR 01, so Senate Concurrent Resolution 01 in 2018 are just fascinating. Like all of the things and all of the arguments that would have happened around suffrage 115 years ago, I'm hearing in person, and I'm like, is this a joke? Are we, like, why, what's happening here? So squeaks out of committee, 6-4, just barely, and then we're gearing up for apparently what's going to be a fight on the House floor. And we spent the next couple weeks just kind of in campaign mode. So it actually was held in rules before it even got to committee, because the rules chair of the House lived and was over where Philo was born. And so like it sat there for a long time. So we finally make it to committee, and then we know that it's going to be kind of a fight going into the House. And we started the Send Martha campaign and had buttons and t-shirts, and we were reaching out to all of the organizations that we had contacts with to contact their senator and let them know that they were supporting it. And it was just this interesting, a lot of the arguments, one of the big arguments that I kept hearing that for us was just, it wasn't the real argument, but it was, that Philo should stay. He was a great man. And for us, it was like, well, of course he was. Philo Farnsworth was an amazing inventor. He invented sorry, all of a sudden my mind went blank. He's the inventor of television. But he had over 70 other inventions. And I mean, we have baby incubators because of the work that he did. So of course he was an incredible Utah. But his statue's been there for over 30 years, and it's time to celebrate a few other things and this opportunity. So anyway, one of my favorite moments, the day that it went into the House, we had there was a group of school children who had written letters to their representative, and these 3 girls came up and had the chance to deliver these handwritten notes to their representative that day on the floor, and actually flipped his vote. And by the time everything came out at the end, there were only 5 representatives that voted against it. So it was an interesting experience. It was really interesting to watch. Our mission at Better Days is to popularize that history, to kind of make space for conversations that are happening in the future. And this far out, I like the space that conversation is happening in a lot better than I did a year ago. And I see now, borne out, that all publicity is good publicity at the end of the day. But living through it for those couple weeks was pretty miserable in the middle of that. So then this last session, 2019, we didn't have as much legislation that was happening. And I want to talk to you a little bit more about the appropriation process, because that's what we were working with during the 2019 session. So in Utah, and we're going to back out for just a second and talk taxes. So Utah has, in their constitution, written in a requirement to balance the budget, and they consistently come out as one of the best managed, they're ranked one of the best managed states in the United States. All of the revenue that comes in, the 2 main sources are income tax, and then we've got sales tax coming in. And the Utah Constitution also spells out that the income tax that's coming in goes straight towards education. All of it for plus years has gone straight to K-12 education. So 20 years ago, we passed a constitutional amendment that said that higher ed could start taking money from that income tax fund. And then we've got sales tax on the other side. And sales tax revenue comes from a few other different sources. And it's the primary revenue for the general fund. And that general fund pays for state government. It pays for court system, public safety, transportation, air quality. Those are the kind of things that's where sales tax is all going towards. So back in the 80s, 70% of the sales tax that was coming in was able to cover all of those things. But as our economy has shifted into more of a services economy instead of an actual goods economy, that 70% has fallen to 40%. And so it's created this imbalance and kind of, the governor's office calls it a fiscal cliff that we're heading towards as we're trying to even those out. So there is the need for tax reform. And I don't know how closely all of you pay attention, but that was what was on the agenda for this session. And the proposal came out 2 weeks before the end of the session. And what it was going to do was lower sales tax, lower income tax, but it was going to add a services tax across the board. And I had this interesting conversation. So in the appropriations process, we're meeting with leadership. And I was sitting in House leadership offices meeting with one of the representatives the morning that sales tax bill came out. And so I'm walking into this meeting, and we've partnered with we're working with some lobbyists in the state, and we went to, because our appropriation is really big, and this year we needed a little bit more help with that. And they're able to get us in and set up these meetings. And so I sit down in this meeting for the appropriation bill, and for 15 minutes get lectured on, from this House member, on the fact, and he wasn't even talking to me, he was talking to the lobbyists that were in there with me, letting them know that they were going to drop the tax bill that afternoon, and that if their clients wanted to get money for, if they wanted to have those, if they were bringing clients in that needed appropriation money, they couldn't be giving out appropriation money with this hand and asking for exemptions on services with this hand. And he said to me, you're just collateral damage in this today. And I said, I can see that. Thanks for your time. and got the whole lecture. And so then the tax bill drops, and it's just chaos. So we've got 2 weeks left in the session, and it's back and forth, and everything's going all over, and everyone's angry. And then a week before the session ends, we find ourselves in an impasse, and the House is like, fine, there's no appropriations. We're just going to pass a base budget. We're going to fund education, and no one else will get any money. And those appropriations fund, there's one bill in there, the first appropriations bill is almost $250 million worth of appropriations for the state of Utah. And it's things like Baby Watch and a whole bunch of social service programs and all of these things. And they're like, nope, we're not going to touch it. And then the other bill is almost $350 million. And they're off the table, and there's only a week left in the session. And we went into the last weekend of the session with no deal, no appropriations, everything's off the table. And Tuesday morning, so the session ends on Thursday, Tuesday morning there's a compromise that's announced, and we come out with that first base budget, and then it wasn't until the very last day of the session that everything finally came together. So when you're asking for an appropriation, in the initial stages, we were meeting with, there's different committees that each of those go through. And our appropriation this year was a really big ask. We were asking for $1 million for the statewide campaign for next year. Appropriations vary in size. You've got appropriations for 10,000, 20, 50, all the different levels. The $1 million ask was something that was really big, and that's why we were working with some different lobbying firms for their help and to get us into those appointments. So we met this last year with every single legislator that sat on the first committee, which is the Business Economic Development and Labor. We call it BEDL for short. Sat with each of them and made our presentation, and then came out of BEDL, that $1 million ask got shaved down to $250,000. And everyone got a haircut this year, but ours felt especially deep and a little bit punitive. And then we started meeting so then we are meeting now with executive appropriations. And they're the ones that decide at the end. So that's the big committee that then goes in and decides who gets what money. And we were asking for a restoration there. So that's what was going on in the middle of all of this other tax chaos. And So coming out of it, it was just this it's a really interesting process. It's actually the reason that I love politics, is you're coming in with all these different stakeholders and all these different players and trying to find compromise and something that works for everyone. So I like that, and I'm also really glad it's over. So one of the other interesting experiences I had during this legislative session was I was meeting with the chair of the Executive Appropriations Committee, and I had our lobbyist with me, and we were talking about the celebration and talking about our plans for next year, and he said to me how refreshing it was to have someone who was not a paid lobbyist come in and talk to him. And I said, well, actually, I do get paid, and he said, yeah, but you're there for a cause. And then he reached out to the woman next to me, and he's like, now remind me your name and tell me who you are again. And she's like, I'm the paid lobbyist. So they're just these funny, just mixed in with that. And anyway, just some really interesting experiences in there. The legislative session is different than the rest of the year. Once that's over, my job description kind of changes for the next little while, and we'll be working with now how to spend the appropriation. And we actually were fully restored on the very last day of the session, but we didn't find out about that until Thursday morning. So it was kind of one of those down to the wire, really interesting experiences. Now all of that work shifts into that statewide campaign and the plans for next year and building those relationships around the state. So back to kind of like just my history and employment experiences and my path into Better Days and what that looked like. I graduated from BYU with a degree in political science. I spent my last semester in an internship up at the Lieutenant Governor's office. And in Utah, the Lieutenant Governor runs all of the elections offices. And so I worked in her elections office. It was Olene Walker at the time, and she was an amazing woman. She went on to be the governor when Mike Leavitt took another position in the cabinet, in the president's cabinet, and she was amazing to work for. And that time in elections was it was fascinating and interesting to me. And I moved from an internship right into working for the elections office. We were working back in the 90s, so this is mid-90s. It's called the National Voter Registration Act, and it was actually the first time that you could register to vote when you applied for your driver's license. And so it was when you would move to a new place and have to renew all of that, it was a way that they were trying to increase voter registration. So we were working with the county clerks on all the nuances and how to make all of that work. It wasn't until I moved from my internship, or started my internship and had my job, that I actually started to understand what the Utah Code was. For some reason, I had made it through all of these political science classes and never quite made the connection to how what we were doing actually applied to the law and where the law was codified and what that looked like. And our job in the elections office was to kind of interpret code and help with the county clerks kind of understand all of that. One of the most interesting experiences from that time, we were helping county clerks and making sure that everything was done right and the elections were run right. And they were having an election down in Big Water, Utah, and for those of you not familiar with Utah, on the border of Utah and Arizona, there's a couple cities where they still practice polygamy. And there's been kind of this agreement where the government just looks the other way, and polygamy is still happening down in those cities. And we flew on a plane down to Page, Arizona, and then drove into Big Water, Utah, so that we could oversee and monitor their election and make sure that it was held to the right standards. And it was a very just interesting experience. I had my first daughter when I was working there in the elections office, and that was one of the things that I never wanted to stay at home and be a mom. I always wanted to be out and working. And I had my first daughter, and I took my maternity leave and went back to work. And I was back at work for about 3 months before I decided that I didn't actually want to be there, and had this whole kind of life shift and was like, I actually want to be home want to be home raising kids. And it was such an interesting experience kind of for me to go through that, just different than what I had planned. And it will be different for every single one of you. Just my advice in that is just to be flexible and to take those decisions to the Lord and figure out what your life path looks like. So I spent those years when my kids were little at home raising kids. And then I gradually started adding, as they got a little bit bigger, more volunteer work back in. And I was filling church callings, and I joined a charter school board, and I was working with the PTA, and all of those things along the way are things and skills and experiences that play into all of the other things that are going to happen in your life. I think that being a mother is one of the greatest job descriptions ever, because it will prepare you for anything that comes your way. And the skills and multitasking and everything that you learn as a mom is stuff that you just get in no other way. We started a family business, and I worked for that for a few years, and it was completely different too. It was a startup, and we were working with manufacturing and design, and I was heading the design department and designing catalogs and doing video productions, and it was just this all hands on deck, all skills, whatever, just things that needed to happen, and you just make it happen. And then a few years later, just a few years ago, I found myself a single mom with 3 teenage daughters, and a different life, and a different, my path suddenly opened totally. And I was like, what do I want to do now? What does my life look like? I have a friend, and she has raised her daughters her whole life, and she says, she tells them that a man is not a financial plan, and that's her quote for her daughters, which I love. But I found myself in that space, and like, well, what do I want to do with the rest of my life? And for me, it was back to my first love. I'm like, I want to get back into politics. I spent a season working for a friend who owned a shop in the mall. It was one of the pop-up shops, and I worked for her that Christmas season, and that was everything that I needed to just be like, I hate this. If I'm going to be working, then I want to do something that I love. And so I worked through the Christmas season there, and then I called up one of my friends who happened to be in the state Senate and said, can I come and work for you? Can I be your intern for this session? And she said, well, I've got an intern. And I said, okay, well, let me just work for you then. You don't have to pay me. Let me just expand your bandwidth. Do all of the things that you don't have time to do during the legislative session. And that's one of the life lessons that I would pass on. Find a mentor. She allowed me to come in, and I worked for her during that session. And I didn't love all of the things that I did. This is one of the other lessons. No job is too small. I didn't love writing the newsletter, but I loved answering constituent emails, but they were also really hard and really tricky and required a lot of research, and I spent a lot of time like trying to figure out the right wording and how to make it sound professional and do all of those things. No job is too small, because the skills that you're learning in each of those play into everything else that you're doing, and they just compound, and they make it easier for you later. All of those hours that I was agonizing over how to word this or how to do that, now those emails are so much easier, and all of that correspondence is so much easier, and writing copy just comes a little bit more naturally because of those little baby steps and all of that work that had gone into that earlier. Learn how to work hard. I love President Uchtdorf's quote. He says, work is an antidote for anxiety, an ointment for sorrow, and a doorway to possibility. And I found that to be true as I went back to work, and have seen, just because of that willingness to work, like these incredible doors open and on all sorts of possibility. I love Henry Ford's "the harder you work, the luckier you get" quote too. That's been one of those things that I just keep seeing over and over again. From the internship, then I found myself working on a campaign a little bit later. And anyone who tells you that, well, I'm going to tell you right now that campaigns are a lot of work, and they're a lot of hard work, and they're a lot of grunt work, and they're a lot of late work, and they're just a lot of work. But when you show up consistently day after day, and you make a name for yourself as being dependable, you have these incredible and amazing opportunities and doors that start opening. One of the other things that I learned is that no job and no person is too small. When I was working kind of as an intern in those Senate offices, I got to know all of the Senate staff. And that has been this amazing thing going back in now as a lobbyist, because I know the ins and outs, I know how things work, I know how committees work, I know how all of these things, and when I don't, I pick up the phone and I call one of my old friends, and they're happy to answer questions because we have a great relationship. And I have found that over and over again in my life. Like, if you're limiting your friendships to the people that are just like you, then you're limiting your possibilities and you're limiting your opportunities. So don't be afraid to make those friendships. Find a mentor. And my last piece of advice is to find or build your tribe. And what I mean by that, So since coming back to work, I've just found this circle of friends built in that is absolutely incredible and amazing and blesses my life over and over and over again. Their support, it's understanding, it's feedback, it's new ideas, it's direction, and there's nothing like having that close core group of friends to just rein you in, cheer you on. You know, they're there for all of the things. And if you don't have that tribe, then build it. And build those relationships. And as a woman in the workplace, that's especially necessary. This tribe is made up of women who are, you know, we've got a senator, we've got a mayor, we've got a congressperson, we've got directors of schools, we've got startup business, you know, people, we've got campaign managers. I mean, just the experience there is so varied, and it's so valuable and useful. Columnists and just all of this group, and you take your problems into that, and you have all of these different eyes and all of those different perspectives working on that, and amazing things happen. And you get the advice that you need and the ideas, and you have your place to kind of vent, and then you come out and you make good stuff happen. So anyway, that's kind of been my experience. I love what I do, and that is one other thing that I would leave with you today. Find what you're passionate about, because then it doesn't feel like a job. It actually becomes what you love, and you're excited about it, and you're excited to make connections with people, and you enjoy the work that you're doing every day. And the more that you can connect with that, the happier that you'll be just in all the rest of your life. So thanks for the opportunity to be here today, and I'm happy to answer questions now.
You know what to do?
I talked so much.
Hi, my name's Emily, and I was wondering, I'm not exactly clear on exactly what your job is, but like, how do you get paid if it's like a lobby?
So lobbying in the state of Utah is not, like, by code, it's not dependent on, it cannot be dependent on your success. Like, you can't be hired to lobby for a bill and be paid if it succeeds and not if it doesn't. So I earn my living through the nonprofit, and we have a contract, and I work on a contract for them. So I'm contracted, you know, for however many hours a week, and I'm paid for that work.
Okay.
Does that?
Yeah, where
and
do
then
they get their money? Is that like their donations and they just like
so
pay it up?
the appropriation is one of our sources, and then it's private. So nonprofits, it's private donations. We have foundation money coming in, and, you know, from individuals, and then corporations, and that's where all of our funding comes from.
Okay.
So, yeah.
Hi, my name's Audrey. I'm a political science major. I was just wondering if you could go into a little bit more how you came across and started working as a lobbyist, how you got hired for that job.
Okay. It was through the campaign, and it was through the internship. So when I was working in the Senate, I saw that first appropriation for Better Days come through, and looked at, you know, a little bit more about what that organization was about, and was really interested in it. And then after the campaign was over, I had met some of the people involved with Better Days, and I went to it was my friend Mandy that we worked on the campaign with, and I said, I really want to work for you. I really want to do this. So it was the connections from the campaign that led through that. So, yeah, I mean, it is. I wish that we could say that, you know, it's all based on hard work, but who you know is so important. And the more that you're willing to talk to people and reach out to people,
We've heard that before.
it's so critical in this field specifically. So, and the other piece of that too, like, I'm working on my master's right now in public administration, because a degree in political science is, it's okay, but when you're applying for positions, like moving forward, they're looking for graduate work. So I'm hoping that, you know, the graduate degree combined with all the connections helps open doors there. So,
Thank you.
yeah.
Hi, my name's Elizabeth Watcott. I'm an international relations major. So you talked a little bit about the pushback on the statue and some other things, and that just got me thinking, what specific obstacles have you noticed for women in politics or lobbying or things like that, either specific to the state of Utah or just politics in general, and what advice would you give specifically to women? Or to men who are going to work with women?
Right. Gender wage gap is a real thing. And especially, for me, who stepped out of the workforce for all of those years, and it was a deliberate choice for me. Like, I went back to raise my family. But that represents lost skills and relevant experience and all of those things. So stepping back in, that's one of the reasons that I'm doing a master's program right now, is because I'm trying to catch up a little bit there. The statistic for Utah is 71 cents on the dollar is what women earn. And I think that there's a perception, it's one of those, they're called wicked problems, where there's a whole bunch of things that contribute into that. Some of it's cultural, some of it's, and some of it is just, it's because women are working in different selected occupations. It's because they need more flexible work schedules. The interesting thing is that Utah women are working at the same level as national. Like, the statistics are not that different. There's this perception that there's more Utah women out of the workforce, and that's not the case. They are working in lower paid positions, though, because they don't have the same education levels, and they don't, there's a whole bunch of factors that play into there. So there is some amazing work that's coming out of the Women's Leadership Institute in Salt Lake. They partnered with the Salt Lake Chamber of Commerce. They actually have this great little workbook that they've just designed, and they have a whole bunch of suggestions about what to do about that, and I actually have some notes here about that if I can find them real quick, about how to close that gap. They are encouraging companies to publish salary information. They're encouraging everyone to take unconscious bias training. Make sure that you're interviewing women, and that you support the companies that are providing flexibility and good work environments. So because of the work on the Martha legislation, I was appointed to the Martha Hughes Cannon Statute Committee. And as we were building our different committees to do that, that was something that was particularly at the front of my mind. And I made sure that as we were looking for committee members, that we had an equal number of men and women on all of the committees that we were building. We made sure as we were going through our final artist selection process that we had men and women. And it's those just deliberate actions that you're taking at all of the steps through that help, that I think will help kind of level the playing field a little bit. It's so frustrating, and to hear someone say, well, we just want, everyone should have the same opportunity. And when I'm hearing that from a legislator, we believe that we just want the best person for the job. And I'm like, it's one thing if the playing field was level, but the playing field has not been level historically. And so let's talk about how to kind of level that playing field, and then we'll always have the best people for the job. So those are my thoughts.
Probably time for one more. There's one more. Yep.
Hi, my name is Cameron Hughes, and I'm a political science major here as well. You talked a little about how you're going back to your bachelor's degree. Can I ask, what opportunities do you see in the future? What other career paths do you think you would pursue with that? Or would you want to change, or maybe run for office? I'm not sure.
So my love is policy. I really am not, having worked on campaigns and had friends that are candidates and in elected office, I'm not particularly, I don't want that life. But the policy is where I'm fascinated. The how to bring all of those different issues together, and how to bring your stakeholders together and work through those for good solutions that work for everybody. What the master's has done for me is just different classes that are giving me kind of the theoretical background for the things that I've seen happen in real life. I'm actually doing an online program out of Southern Utah University, and it's based on a lot of it's based on experiential learning. And so the projects that I'm doing, for this one of my classes this semester is on public economics, and I'm writing about the appropriations process and writing about our Better Days budget and those kind of things. So it's the all extra levels of connections and knowledge that you're building.
Awesome, thank you.
So yeah.
Join me in thanking our speaker. I won't see you next week, but we'll see you next week.